and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara Seidler.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
This week, the United Nations released its most comprehensive report yet on the state of fertility around the world. The report confirmed that global fertility rates are dropping and that it's not necessarily for the reasons we're often told it is. In today's podcast, we'll unpack the findings of the UN report, how this is manifesting here in Australia, and how governments can address this issue moving forward.
Hello to our YouTube audience. I'm just popping in here before the deep dive to say, if you could press subscribe to our YouTube channel, that would be so helpful. We have a very specific goal to try to get to 20,000 subscribers before the end of the month. If you can help us get there, we would be very appreciative. Now, on to the deep dive. Zara, when we talk about fertility rates, I feel like we often talk about specific countries.
Yeah.
So I know in Japan, for example, we often talk about the declining birth rate.
That's the big one.
There.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that this report is looking at the globe as a whole and what is happening absolutely everywhere with the fertility rate.
Yeah, it's why it's such a big report, because it is looking at the state of play across a bunch of different countries from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and it's finding a similar kind of through line or a similar trend.
So what did it find?
So essentially the short answer is that it found that global fertility rates are declining across the board. According to that same report, the human population is projected to reach its peak within the century, but then from there, it's going to fall. So I feel like for our whole life, we've spoken about how, we have more people on Earth than ever and overpopulation. But what this is saying is that actually that human population is going to fall. 1 in 4 people are currently living in a country where the size of the population is understood to have already hit that peak. And so I think it's helpful to paint the picture here in Australia, where our birth rate has been falling for decades. And I know you and I have spoken about this on the pod before. If we go back to the 50s, the birth rate in Australia was 3.5 babies per woman. In 2008, that birth rate was 2.02 children per woman. And then in 2023, it was 1.5 children per woman.
Wow. So it has dropped quite significantly.
Yeah, it's only going in one way.
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear that there is this trend over the last few decades of women in Australia having less children.
I think it's helpful whenever we're talking about a declining birth rate to understand why it can be considered an issue, particularly an economic issue, which you don't often think about, women having babies as something that is a global or even on the specific country level, an economic issue for that country. But it kind of is.
Yeah, I mean, it's something you and I strangely find ourselves speaking about a lot. And certainly when you've sat down and interviewed treasurers or shadow treasurers, this is something that's come up. The reason it's an economic issue is that basically we have an aging population at the same time as we have a shrinking working population. And so if I just unpack that really clearly, we've got people getting older and living for longer, which is great. I mean, depends on who you ask, but objectively a good thing, living standards, but fewer people that are then of working age and who are contributing to the economy. And so the consequence of that is that there is this increased economic pressure on governments. So like I just said, that's because we have less people being able to work and pay taxes, which is the key way that the government raises money, and more people in that aging population who require assistance, whether that be health services, the pension, whatever it is that they need in their old age. There is this incongruence between where the money is coming from and what it's being spent on. And the other thing I think that isn't spoken about very often, though, is the fact that it means there's a lot of pressure on younger people to care for older people and the economic burden that can carry if they have to leave the workforce for that.
So to put it really simply, and maybe this is too simplistic, but we have less people paying taxes and more people needing taxpayer money.
Correct. Yeah, that's it.
Got it. So we know that it can be a bad thing for economies. What did this report tell us about why there is this declining birth rate?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the golden question, and it's certainly the one that this UN report was trying to answer. I'll just quickly run through what this report actually was, because I'd certainly never seen anything of its kind. Essentially, it was undertaken by the UN Population Fund, and it surveyed 14,000 people across 14 different countries about their fertility intentions. The final report was called The Real Fertility Crisis, and it was a very, very long read. So I guess I'll just give you a too long didn't read, which is to say that the fertility rate is declining not because people don't want to have children, but rather that they are prevented from making the decision to have children because of external factors. So let me just really clearly simplify that. The UN isn't saying that there is a fertility crisis because young people don't want to have kids. What they're saying is hundreds of millions of people aren't having the number of children they want because the conditions just aren't right for them to be able to do that. And before I go any further, Billi, I do just want to highlight that, of course, there are factors, including infertility, that can prevent people very clearly from starting families. And that's really, really significant. But for the sake of this discussion, the UN is broadly looking at the fertility rate, and it's trying to understand if it's because people want less children or because they feel like they have to have less children. And essentially, the report finds the latter. It's that they feel like they have to have less children. The UN Population Fund Director said it's often assumed or implied that fertility rates are the result of free choice. Unfortunately, that is not the whole picture.
That is so interesting and relatable.
Yeah, I think it is. And I mean, I feel like people anecdotally probably know this to be the case, but this is the first kind of report that has told us, or at least has the data to support the fact that it's not that broadly across the board, young people are saying, no, we're not interested in having children. And it was really interesting. The report compiled a bunch of headlines from across the globe that said like young feminist women no longer want children, or they've gone a different path, and all these headlines. And it was like, no, this isn't actually the issue that when you ask people is what's coming back. It's that there are these conditions that are not allowing them to realize what it is they might actually want.
Wow.
Yeah.
Zara, you mentioned that there were some other reasons why women and couples are choosing to not have more children. What are those other reasons?
Well, I'll go first through the economic reasons because those make up kind of the first three main reasons. The first being that 39% of respondents said that financial limitation had affected or would affect their ability to achieve their desired family size. 21% said that it was about job insecurity. 19% said it was about housing. So clearly that economic context that people find themselves in is playing a really, really big role. Another interesting stat from the report, and it's certainly something I feel like comes up in a lot of conversations I'm a part of or I'm listening to, is that 1 in 5 people said fears about the future, including things like climate change, wars, and pandemics, would lead them or has led them to having fewer children than desired. Interestingly, only 12% of people cited infertility or difficulty conceiving for not having the number of children that they wanted. And I was quite surprised by that number, to be honest. It was much lower than I thought it would be. And of course, this is just one report. This hasn't spoken to every woman everywhere, but I just thought that that was interesting.
Yeah, often when I think about infertility, I think that in the past 10 years or so, we have come leaps and bounds when it comes to having really open discussions about the issues surrounding infertility and how it can feel to be a woman going through that.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe it's not the case that more women are experiencing infertility, but it's the case that more women are talking about it.
Yeah, and what the report actually highlighted was that one of the big areas of concern is the inaccessibility of these fertility services or the assistance that they can provide, that while there are many in the world that can access them, for so many they are still inaccessible. And that's one of the things that they think need to change for more people to have the family or the size of the family that they want.
Okay, so we know there's a declining fertility rate. We know that's a problem and we know why it's happening. Did the UN have any ideas about how to solve this issue?
Well, the report was basically saying that attempts that governments are making around the world, things like a baby bonus or an incentive to have a baby, isn't actually getting to the root cause of the issue, and that they don't believe that that's actually going to move the dial at all. I want to focus in on one example of these sorts of incentives that we've actually spoken about on this podcast before, but it's a local version, so I think it's quite interesting. And that was the idea put forward by Matt Canavan. He's a national senator. His recommendation was to give couples an $100,000 loan for their first home when they have their first child, and then if they have 3 children, that the loan would be wiped. And while shockingly, the UN didn't specifically address Matt
Canavan.
Canavan. I don't think his own party has addressed that proposal. However, broadly, the UN did talk about this movement of, we've seen it in Hungary, we've seen it in other countries, of offering specific incentives, especially to women, to have more children. What it was saying was investing in structural changes is the only thing that is going to shift the dial. And when I say structural changes, we're talking about things like paid parental leave, the accessibility of childcare, addressing housing issues, and ensuring access to reproductive health services. They're saying, if you offer those bonuses, that's not going to do anything. Do all of these things, and maybe then we'll see the fertility rate rise again in the opposite way that it's been going for decades.
So they're saying you can't fix this long-term issue with short-term solutions.
Exactly. And again, I feel like, even if I look at our comment section, anytime we report on these sorts of bonuses or incentives, like everyone in our comment section is saying the same thing, that no, this wouldn't be enough to actually shift the dial. But I think having the UN come out and have surveyed so many people across the world and to have come to this conclusion, it'll be interesting to see if any governments pick up on it. Of course, here in Australia, there have been a lot of pieces of legislation when it comes to paid parental leave and childcare, but perhaps not this like suite of reforms aimed at raising the fertility rate. It can be a bit of a hot topic and people feel very strongly when they hear, especially male politicians, talking about it. So definitely an interesting one to see if governments take up this kind of call to action.
Zara, thank you for taking us through that. It was a 160-page report.
Yes.
So we very much appreciate you reading every single word and then summarising it for us here.
Yeah, I like that.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back again this afternoon with your evening headlines. But until then, have a great day.